So you've had a little time to chew that over, because unless you chew it, it's a lot to swallow. This is where we take the premise of NLP seriously. Structure, experience, we'll try that again. Experience has a structure. If you change the structure, you'll change the experience. We're talking about a formal structure that takes into account outcomes, criteria, evidence, which is another way to say future counterfactual events, criteria, evaluations, sensory-based experience, places it in an algorithmic format, that is to say something that iterates over time and is responsive to its situation. And can be applied to a wide variety of expressions that we call making decisions, motivating ourselves, convincing ourselves, learning, memory, creativity, checking what's real and not real. And that by looking at these in a certain way, we can point out certain kinds of predictable difficulties. That is, that if you have a decision strategy and you need to create options for yourself, if you don't have the neurology of the constructed side of the hemispheres, you're not going to have that ability. And that if you don't generate a sufficient number of options, that you're going to feel constrained and less than choiceful. But wait, there's more. There comes the question of how one tests for their options. This goes to the idea that if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. What kind of test do you make? Is it always against the same thing? Like, yes, I've done the same things before, everything's going fine. Or do you test in the sense of having some variety from what you've done before? So you can see how metaprograms begin to come into play in this as well. So all of these things show up in this area called strategies. And we've seen one example so far, one I've talked about, that making a shift in that strategy can have a profound and pervasive effect across the person's experience. Because we make decisions in so many places in our lives, because we motivate ourselves in so many places in our lives, because, as Jean was so gracious to give us a demonstration of, that when we have a structural difficulty, such as a divided mind, that it not only shows up in the big decisions where it matters, but that it also tends just to be in a number of our experiences because this underlying format is being used in so many different places. This could be called, in a way, the structure of unhappiness. That is, that someone might have some divided mind and then tend to ameliorate that by meditation, by supplements, by drugs, by another strategy to deal with it. You know, whenever I get in a situation, I roll dice. You've read the book, The Dice Man. You know, there's all these different ways that people actually are trying to solve something that they experience as them, when in fact it's a strategy. Now this goes to Maxwell Maltz. If you're familiar with his book, Psycho-Cybernetics, it was NLP before it was called NLP. And Maxwell Maltz was, since passed away of an elderly age, he was a plastic surgeon. And he noticed in doing plastic surgery that some people's lives changed. I mean, little correction in the nose, boom, suddenly they were gorgeous, they were sociable, complete personality change. Other people would be coming back for the third and fourth surgery, and they still were the same. And they still had the same difficulty. And Maltz began to wonder how much this surgery was a form of the placebo effect, and how much really it was what the person had in mind, as opposed to on skin, that was making the difference. And he was one of the first people to apply cybernetic ideas to the generation of thinking. And in this, he noticed that the way that people thought about their situations was different than them. What he's put it this way. He says, you have a machine, you are not a machine. I bring that up now as perhaps a useful analogy. That is, you have strategies. You are not your strategies. Your strategies you can upgrade. Your strategies you can change. Your strategies may have resulted in you experiencing life in a certain way, but that doesn't mean that that's what it has to be, nor does it mean that's the way you are. Though, as I point out, this mistake is often made with this kind of work because it is so close. Because people do motivate themselves every day. As I said in a previous program, that these kinds of strategies are operating all the time. It's just you only notice them when they don't work. You know, if you go in and you pick out the shirt and you're done, and you go and you pick out the meal and you're done, and you pick out the spouse and you're done, and and your life just goes along, why would you notice it? But when you're going, oh, I don't know what to do, then we notice it. And then, unfortunately, other kinds of phrasing come into play, like no pain, no gain. Well, if it's going to be a big gain, it's got to be a big risk, Well, I'm here to tell you that I work with people who are, quote, high-risk decision makers, and there's two things I'll tell you right off. One is risk is constant. Yeah, let the other shoe drop on that one. Risk is constant? Yeah, people will subject themselves to the same amount of risk. And when something makes it less risky seeming, they'll risk more. Or as one of my colleagues, one of my teachers told me, better brakes makes cars go faster. Risk is constant. If you think your car can stop because you have ABS, then suddenly you drive more recklessly because it's not really more recklessly because you have better brakes. So really, if you want to reduce the number of accidents on America's highways, put bad brakes on all the cars. And everybody would drive much more carefully. It's counterintuitive, but it gives you a little insight into the cybernetics of human decision making. The other is that people who are professional risk takers risk a measured percentage in their different endeavors. They don't roll the dice on things, not even the big things, not even the ones you read about in the news. When somebody like Steve Jobs places a $50 million bet on Pixlar, that's a lot of money for us. It's a lot of money for Jobs. Just remember, he measures his wealth in billions. So suddenly you get a little perspective there, right? It was a risk. It was a measure. It would be like you putting this much in this stock and this much there and this much into savings and this much into some antiques or whatever. It's more measured than people like to make it look like. They understand this. So they also understand they have strategies. And that what you want to do is you want to upgrade the quality of your strategies. This is why I get a lot of interest from these people. Because they're very interested in this structural idea. That in some cases what you want to do is you want to bring all of the criteria back into the beginning of the strategy instead of spreading it out. You want to bring it back up here where it belongs. You want to make sure that you have a number of options that you're generating. You want to make sure that they're generated on a number of criteria. But even then, people being people will find a way to screw it up. I'm going to tell you about an experiment. I don't know where they get the money, but if you know, please call me, tell me. I want to talk to these people. They did this experiment where they would go up and they would give people airline tickets to two locations they said they really wanted to go to for the same day and the same time. Now, believe it or not, over half the people didn't go to either place. This is a way of saying that there's a lot of work about decision making that we can make use of in NLP. This is a demonstration of the idea that human beings do not know how to deal with positive options. We're much better at the lesser of two evils than we are at the better of two goods. What we found in NLP upon investigating this kind of thing in more detail is that people will catch themselves in a positive bind because they do not have sufficient evidence for their criteria. For example, they'll go, wouldn't it be great to go to the mountains this summer? We could go to a class for a week. We go up to Aspen. The music and all that, this would be great. And they think about the music, and all this and Aspen, and then they go, well, wait a minute. we could also go to the beach. You know, the beach, the beach, and the heat, on this, just putting your feet in the sand and feeling the waves and, and now they got trouble. Because they've got the mountains, the way it looks, and the music and Aspen and all that, and they've got the beach. Feels so, and the warm sun on you. I've exaggerated for purpose. You get it, don't you? There's a separation of rep systems. And the way that you go about resolving this particular structural problem. Because literally, I have met people in trainings that couldn't make a decision because of a couple of reasons, but because they only had a partial representation of one option and a partial representation of the other. Now, this can be important feedback. I mean, how many of you signed up for a course like this having heard about it? How many of you signed up after you read a book? How about a session with somebody? How about you went to a weekend first in order to find out if it was really what they claimed in the books before you just, in other words, and I had this too, because I read about this stuff and I went, this is incredible. And I went, yeah, and you can write anything. I was a fiction major for a while in college. I know how, Carlos Castaneda, fiction or fact, who knows? It's the same thing. These NLPers, and it's like, who knew? So that wasn't enough for me. I needed a richer representation. I needed a representation I could step into and be in that room and experience it before I was willing to make a decision about it. And a number of staff, this is a good idea. And that's what we're playing with here, is that people will get themselves caught between options, positive options, because they have criteria, but they have not represented that criteria in all of the representational systems. And neither have they made an evaluation about that, whether they really like it or not. In other words, what I would suggest to the person with the beach and the mountain difficulty would be to step into the mountain adventure as fully and completely as possible. And if they couldn't, to get more information. And then, you got the woods around you, you're going to go to town sometimes, there's a music festival, and you hear this, and what's the weather like? Oh, it's kind of chilly. The mountains, didn't think about that. Do we like that? In other words, get the full representation, the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic tactile, the kinesthetic proprioceptive. Not much air up here in the mountains. Olfactory, oh, wow, that's nice, the pine. Okay, get the whole thing, have a feeling about that. How do you like that? Step out. Then step in fully into the representation of the beach. Yes, of course, the toes in the sand and the water and the warm. And what about the sound? Yeah, seagulls and stuff. What about the smells? The ocean, walruses. So, you want to get the whole, whatever it is, you want to be sure that you get all of what's really there, as much as you can know it. Have feelings about that. Step out. And then, which do you like better now? Now, once again, this strikes people as a little, they said, what do you mean now? Well, because you're going to make the decision now about then. And again, the idea here is not about either of these vacations specifically, though at least the person chose. You're realizing that in over 50% of the cases, they stayed home. They chose, and now that they've done something, they begin to get feedback so they can improve that decision-making over time. You understand, this is not merely about the moment. A lot of NLP training is about changing that moment. Change personal history or re-imprinting. It's about changing some particular part of the person's experience. The circle of excellence, changing a particular moment in their future so they can be resourceful then. These are great for that. Strategies, you're looking at not only are you putting something pervasive in process, that is the idea of reducing conflict, as we started with Gene, but in the example I'm giving you, it's also putting in motion a process. Whenever the person is met with multiple options, they go, okay, I know what to do. Go get enough information so I can really step into that picture and be that in that movie and feel it, make an evaluation, step out, check out the alternatives, step out, and at that point, if I don't have enough information, what? Go to a weekend seminar, right, go to a weekend seminar. take a weekend away. Go to find out what you want to buy a house by the water. Go live there during hurricane season. I mean, do something to get a fuller representation. Then you're iterating a strategy where the person starts to make those kinds of choices. They start to realize, oh, I don't have to make a decision and I'm done. I can keep making decisions and refining my criteria and my ability to decide. So this is another, as I say, we're looking, what are the difficulties we've seen so far? Lack of choice, polarity, divided mind, lack of evidence. These are different structural problems that a person can have in a strategy, which then they might, somebody said, oh, this person is not very good at making decisions, or they might think, oh, I can never make up my mind. Whereas what was happening was they didn't know, well, you step fully into the picture and try out the movie, and you decide based on that. They simply didn't know about that extra, it's called a meta strategy, that extra meta strategy. So I'm going to pause at this point. Any questions about the kind of proposal I'm making here? Eric?
In the beginning, you said that word counterfactual future. Would you discuss that?
Well, I was being a little fancy there, Eric. The idea is that the future that we want probably isn't the future that would happen anyway. The counterfactuals is a linguistic form that I'm very interested in because a lot of stuff is based, science is based on counterfactuals. And well, the idea, if you have a proposal, you have something that's not there, futures are based on that. The idea that you want something that isn't there. You want to create a future. And you have to make efforts to do that. And so it's different than what might be the case. In fact, you are thinking about it as different than what might be the case, and therefore you have to put more effort into it to make sure that it is the case. And that's a very kind of interesting, if you think about that as a human possibility. Because in many ways, we have a lizard brain, if you're aware of this. I know this because of this thing about the vacations, that people will work hard all year long and then get in a big silver tube, fly across great water, you know, and then they'll land somewhere that they can lay on the sand and act like a lizard, you know. That's a lot of work to get to your lizard brain, but this is what a lot of people do. But that's different. The lizard would look for a nearby rock. People don't like, oh, there's a road, I could go lie in the road. We don't do that. You know, we have this whole imagination thing going on where we imagine what isn't the case, and then we can organize ourselves to respond to that and to feel good or bad, you know, depending on whether we're getting closer or farther away from that. And as I'm trying to say here, castigate ourselves for not having the proper mental equipment, when in fact, as Maxwell Maltz would say, you have a machine. You aren't that. And of course, you can upgrade this as you learn more about how it works. Yeah, Rick.
I have an indirect question.
Sure.
On the notation in these that we've been experiencing here. There's like a small n preceding a...
Oh, there's a lot of notational stuff. And yes, well, people wonder about the notation, and I'm happy to allow you to wonder. And the thing about any notation is that it's there to help you. And one of the reasons I went for the ordinary language of our earlier is because if you start saying to people, oh, I see you're having a negative k, this is not ordinary language. And yet there is a technical language, a calculus, if you will, in NLP about strategies. And some of the more important parts of that calculus have to do with that, for example, someone sees a picture and they will have a feeling about it, right? And we'll put an M there for meta, because your kinesthetic, you understand that there's not just one kinesthetic. There are actually 4 kinesthetics. There's tactile, you can feel it. There's proprioceptive, muscular. There's muscular kinesthetic. There's vestibular. The balance is a kinesthetic. And there's visceral, gut reactions, kinesthetic. Now, the gut reaction kinesthetics are a different order than the other ones. These happen to be older, they're glandular. That is to say, they're part of what's known as the autonomic nervous system, whereas the other kinesthetics are central nervous system. Now, what difference does that make? Touching, the only way I know I'm touching the back of this chair is that the touch hairs are translated by electrical impulses which go to the brain and somehow translate into, this is soft, rough material. Central nervous system. Same thing about tilting my head. I get signals as this changes that there's different balances going on. If I tighten my muscles, another signal goes up. But the autonomic nervous system actually releases chemicals, and it's slower. And this is the evaluative K. If you like downhill skiing or driving fast in a car or even being a passenger with the wind in your hair, you get all the central nervous system information and you feel good about it, or you feel scared about it. It's a different kinesthetic. It's the evaluative kinesthetic. It's emotions, feelings, they're here. Now, we can feel them through our body, certainly, but we're talking about the origins and the physiological differences, the gut reaction. So the meta-K refers to that visceral autonomic system, the evaluation of all the stuff that comes before, whether it's the sound of an internal voice, whether it's how you feel after lunch, whether it's the interest that this topic is getting for you. These are these subtle differences, which are ongoing, make a difference in our experience. Plus or minus, because what is that evaluation? Is it positive? Is it negative? How do we interpret that? It's an evaluation. It's a kinesthetic evaluation of those other experiences.
So in the notation, does the M go with the K and the evaluation?
Yes, because it's meta to the visual. So you have the visual, meta to that is the kinesthetic, meaning how do you feel about the picture?
I've heard things like meta-visual, positive or negative. Is that possible?
A meta-visual.
Or auditory. You use auditory to let you know that it's right or wrong. You don't necessarily have a feeling about it.
I have my doubts.
Okay.
Ron is raising, again, as a field that has no official research arm. Certainly internal dialogue is, so if you have an experience. So let's go from this. We see something, we feel good, and then what do? We might go, ooh. Now, you could talk about that auditory being meta to the kinesthetic because it's an auditory about the feeling.
You have a visual experience, say for example, I don't know, positive or negative, and you went ooh, and it didn't have anything to do with feeling?
I don't think so. That's what I'm saying. In my experience, no, is that if somebody so I'm going into the shop and I see something and I go, ooh, well, really quickly what I did is I saw it, felt good about it, and then had a response to that. So my response, like, ooh, is to that, but also to my feelings. So, brrr. So just a little there on the nomenclature, the official jargon. Yes?
Maybe he's asking something like a synesthesia where the auditory and the kinesthetic are so close that it seems like it's an auditory
Auditory, kinesthetic.
yeah.
Both
Synesthesia
at the
pattern.
same time, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, synesthesias is another complete topic. And fundamentally, synesthesias could be like people who hear colors, people who see sounds. And you find in certain artists, they'll talk about this. They'll say, or even among yourselves, it might be wine for you, it might be a certain food where people will say, oh, this is really hot. Or they'll say, well, no, it kind of sparkles. You know, in other words, they'll make a translation. On the one, I'm sort of stepping around it, as Eric can see, but I'm not, because it's actually a very common experience in little ways. Well, it is in language. It'll be like you'll taste something and you'll go, well, you know what would really help this if they could somehow brighten it, somebody would say. You know, and, well, I would say. And that's a synesthesia pattern between the gustatory and the visual. So we have all these little overlaps. In fact, they're overlapped in the brain back here, not just on me. And those can become more pronounced, and a number of artists express that very much, or chefs will talk about that it's missing a note. You know, they'll be making some dish and they'll go, well, it's missing its base notes or something, and they'll have to figure out what to put in to get that. Even more common are the synesthesias that happen between the auditory and the kinesthetic, the visual and the kinesthetic. People's strategies tend to be of the form of going to visual kinesthetic or auditory kinesthetic because of habit. People get very good at taking those kinds of routes. And previously I did the John Grinder exercise where I said, look at a color, imagine the color's a sound, imagine it's a feeling. The ease with which you were able to do those indicated your experience, your preference, your habit. That you had spent more time doing, so the auditory to kinesthetic was easy, but the visual was more difficult. And that just indicates that you actually have a lot of connections built up between one system and another. There's a whole other area that we can go into in terms of this neurophysiology. And given our limits on time, and given that some of this is out there, I prefer to spend the time on the different kinds of strategies and the different kinds of structural difficulties. Because I say, you can turn the thing on its head and listen to the kind of complaint somebody has and begin to think, oh, I got some ideas. Because we go to the next kind of structural difficulty, that would be criteria. Right there. See, it makes it easy because they're listed. So criterial difficulties come in several forms. One is the misapplication of criteria. For example, what are the 4 food groups? Beer, coffee, chocolate, potato chips. Sorry, I forgot there. Okay. French fries. You know, it's like, so when people say, well, what are the 4 food groups? I mean, the joke being that if you're applying inappropriate criteria, it doesn't matter how great your eating strategy is. Well, you know, I visualize my food, and then I imagine how it's going to feel in my stomach, and then I wait a while, and then I sit down to a full plate of French fries. Because it's a start, a basic food group, right? So Leslie, in her book Know-How, spends a great deal of time on how to revise criteria, the idea of having people make appropriate criteria for the part of their life they're in, and then how to build reference experiences, that is, how to get experience with applying certain criteria, just by practice. Another question is, you may have criteria, but what is your evidence for that criteria? For instance, good food. Fried, mayo. Good food comes in a box. So, and well, but my point again is that these are the slippages that people don't check for. Does the criteria apply? Is the evidence for the criteria appropriate? And even more structurally oriented difficulty is the criteria consistent? And this was the difficulty that Rick shared with us. That in his case, he had what I took to be some very good criteria. Preserving something, time together, availability, making sure the costs aren't too much, all of these significant criteria. But if your criteria start slipping around in terms of what's important, what's that going to do to the decision process? Yeah, it's going to keep changing the decision. And if you are as self-aware a person as Rick and probably his partner is, then you're aware of that, and so they renegotiate, as opposed to making a decision and pretending it didn't happen, which is another strategy. Yes, we're operating from the same criteria. We haven't changed our mind once. But on the other hand, you are self-aware enough to notice that that this isn't, that, you know, oh, we've got to renegotiate here. And you're relationship oriented enough, another higher criteria that you want to do that. I would suggest that there's another way to do this, especially if you're in a continued relationship with this person. And that is that you could establish some very important criteria that you put at the top consistently that would allow certain decisions to then be made quite easily, knowing that that criteria was going to come up every time anyway. Why negotiate it to the point where it pops up when you know you're going to get there later anyway? You know, again, sort of moving it back to the front, but also holding it constant. Does that interest you? Yeah? It doesn't have to. It's just a theory.
Well, you asked if it was familiar. It
Mhm.
is familiar, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it runs throughout life.
Well, so why don't you come on up if you would, and let's do a little with this bad boy. In fact, here you go. And this, by the way, goes back to the value of contrastive analysis. And we go back to the idea of you're getting that snack. And you think about the criteria that you have, that it tastes good, it's nutritious, and you get energy. How do you think of those criteria?
Well, taste is olfactory. I mean, gustatory. I taste it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I taste the pear. I taste the apple.
Okay, so they're sensory-based in that
They're
sense.
sensory-based,
Right.
yes.
But how do you think of the arrangement of those? Is one more important than the other? Are they like all there at once?
Energy is more important.
Okay.
Energy, nutrition, and taste.
Mm-hmm.
1, 2, 3.
But do you think of them as 1, 2, 3, or do you think of them as combined? How would you think of them?
Well, I think of the energy as separate,
Okay.
but taste and nutrition are very much combined.
Okay. And how come you don't have more than that?
Well, I could.
Yeah.
In fact, when I thought about them, I looked at the I looked at the pear. The pear looked good.
Mm-hmm.
So appearance is also there. Yeah.
Okay. Now, my point here is multiple-fold. One is that you notice he can deal very easily with a restricted set of criteria here. And although he didn't sort them out before, he can sort them out fairly easily. What I'm doing is accessing that to utilize over here. Because he could be doing that over here as well and find out how he could begin to develop a hierarchy. So he developed a higher criteria. What was really important is energy. And then how it looked. And he has a complex equivalence between tastes good and looks good going on. The fruit looks good. And that probably means you also buy good quality as well. So
Probably does,
and you don't
yeah.
even speak to that. So in that same way, we want to find out over here on this relationship side, this decision making in a relationship, is like energy, what has to be there, and it's right at the top. Because if you start to think that way, that may simplify the decision process. And once again, I'm speaking to you, but I'm speaking of you and your spouse, your wife, the bigger relationship.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could remind you, you want to preserve something of what she's there for. Of course, you're here for this course. There's also the time together. There's the cost. There's the availability of transportation. There were others. I would ask, what of all of this is really important, like that energy in that other situation really needs to be there?
Okay. My wife is very other-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And so a high criterion, it was hard work getting her to come to Aspen for a while.
Okay.
Until she stepped into it and began to imagine it. I could see it happening.
Can we pause here?
Yes.
This is for everyone listening in, if she, not you, if she was really other-oriented, she would have done what he wanted. Right, so I'm bringing this to your attention. Just because somebody utilizes the jargon doesn't mean they know what they're talking about. Okay? But this is great because we're getting high quality. If you ignore the jargon and listen to the structure, you're getting high quality information. There was something about she needed to step into, he found it difficult, that's got to be, that's his experience. The truth is that's his experience. But throwing that other word in, that word other, because we're so familiar with our jargon, can throw us off. Does that make sense? Okay, back to our show. Okay.
Okay. All right.
So it was difficult until she stepped into.
So anyway, I have a real part of what I want at a pretty high level is that she has a good experience there.
Okay.
And she's a musician and a pianist and a teacher, and it's a transformative thing to go to Aspen.
Okay. I want you to hold that because you got that there. Yeah. All right. Now, you've got it. You don't need to hold it like this.
Okay.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's something similarly the case for her. Is that right or not? You said she said to step into. What did she step into?
Well, she was reluctant to go to Aspen because of she didn't want to spend the money and take the time, and there were things to do at home.
Sure.
So there were obstacles for her in going to Aspen.
And then she stepped into what?
And then as we talked about it, and she stepped into being in Aspen. She loves to practice up there, and so there are these little practice rooms adjacent to a stream and up in the mountains with the grand piano, and so she started to re-experience that, and things changed.
All right. So that was something you had to encourage.
Yes.
So tell me about that value. I mean, on the one hand, you wanted to come to this course.
Right.
But you also weren't leaving her in a hotel room. You actually noticed that there was this really rich experience available for her, and you helped make that real for her.
Well, it really wasn't an either or.
Well, that's my point, is that what's that value in there?
For me.
About your value, yeah, about this experience for you and making sure there's this experience for her.
Well, I guess it's almost a life issue. It's a survival issue. I think that it's crucial for people to keep learning and growing.
Okay. All right.
You can see its importance.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to give you, this deserves a new sheet, is that this experience of learning, growing, and I want to take that a bit further and say there's something more personal about it, because I mean, I'm involved in this work and you're up here for this, so we could both say in a sense we're interested in people learning and growing. But there's something even more, I think anyway, that it's easy for me to imagine when it's about this, the person you're closest to in life, the person you share your life with.
Well, yeah, I would say.
Yeah.
And you want me to figure that out?
Well, I think that you probably already know what that value is. You might call it love. You might call it mutual respect, a confluence, an enfolding. I don't know what your word might be for that.
Well, love is really there. I mean, that's the heart of it, yeah.
Yeah. And there's some way that's manifest in the idea of wanting to have her have this experience. And what is that in you? What would you call that value?
Gosh. Help me.
Those of you in relationship, what is that you want so much to create something? What is that?
Affection, caring.
Well, no, it's
Sharing.
Experiencing a full life.
I guess it's helping her to be more complete.
Okay, all right.
That-
More complete. And this trip, this whole trip, isn't just about this course and her going to Aspen. There's something about the two of you doing this.
Yes.
Because, I mean, you could have flown out here on Boone. You could have sent her out. You could have flown her out here.
Right.
So what's that about?
Wow. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's about life together.
Okay, yeah. I see that.
They're really tears of joy.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Funny thing about the body, at each extreme, it has this response that looks the same, but it's so different.
Wow.
And look what modern technology has invented. Now, I'm going to keep us on task here because actually I have something I'm doing that I think may be helpful to the situation because it's my preference, given what I'm seeing, that you and your wife get to experience more learning and growing and completing and life together than negotiating, the shuttles and stuff. That there will be shuttles always. There will be, the transportation and getting from here to there. But when one understands what motivates that, then that can just be transportation. That becomes less important. Because I would suggest, as the beginning of a hierarchy of criteria here, that while preserve something, time together, cost, course availability are important in this decision, what's more important and what's consistent across these kinds of moments is that you notice it's about life together, about being more complete in each other, and about learning and growing. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
I do, and I think that we do. Yeah.
Okay.
Largely.
Largely, okay. So are these more to the top? Would you give an order to those or not, or are those all together?
Well, I'd put cost and convenience way at the bottom.
All right, so let's put them way at the bottom. They're at the bottom.
So more complete.
Life together, learning, growing.
Well, 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3?
Right.
All right. And then we've got stuff like preserve something, availability of transportation. They say reality will intervene in this at some point anyway.
Sure.
So those go somewhere in the middle?
Well, preserving has to do with the learning.
Okay.
The experience at Aspen, that's the deal.
Okay.
Okay.
So what I'm going to suggest is similar to what you saw with Jean, is that what we're first of all doing here is instead of bringing all the criteria together, the criteria is there, but part of it was unexpressed. That is that it was relational. And so I was saying, well, there's this bigger relationship. You're going through all these negotiations at this level for this criteria. Why not bring this criteria to bear right here in this decision? And so then you begin to understand that if you think about life together, why would she want to wait another day when she could come and get you and then ride back through the mountains with you?
Well, that's part of it.
Yeah.
That is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, as opposed to, oh, the inconvenience, the cost or whatever. And why would you mind, going down the mountain to Empire to meet up with her?
I don't.
Yeah, right. So here's the thing, is to think about these criteria, life together, more complete, learning, growing, persevering, and the other considerations, and holding them in mind in that way, think about making this transportation decision and find out what happens. In other words, just with this new ordering, let it roll forward and find out how it's different.
Well, it's very peaceful. It's not when we, I guess when we talk about it tonight, we'll still need information,
Of course.
but it'll be more fun and more easy to deal with. So,
Okay.
you know, that's what I'm seeing.
All right.
And
And you see he's calmer now. Remember, he went on and on before. If you go back to the other diagram, he said this and this and this and this and this and that and this and that. Now it's like, well, there's this, and we'll do it. Now, of course, keeping in mind she didn't go through this experience, but I imagine in some way you'll find a way of sharing this.
I imagine you're right.
Yeah. I want to thank you for coming up and demonstrating this.
Well, thank you for your
Yeah.
ability.
Well,
Here.
I want people to know that this was the beginning of hierarchy of criteria when Leslie Cameron Bandler met Michael LeBeau. Because a lot of people in NLP before that point were doing exactly what Rick was doing, which was they'd have the criteria, it'd slide around, and she met Michael, and Michael knew what he wanted, and he'd go for it, and he was pleased when he got it, and when he didn't get it, he knew why, and Leslie looked at Michael and went, what's different? And she noticed that Michael had hierarchy of criteria. And let's make a point here, especially those that have done the advanced course with Steve Andreas and I. This is a heterarchy. This is the hierarchy for this part of life. Now, the fact that it's relationship, it's probably a lot of your life has this in it. But you might have a different hierarchy of criteria for your work. You might have a different hierarchy of criteria for an emergency or something. You know, in other words, your hierarchy doesn't, when you make a hierarchy of criteria, that doesn't mean in all cases. It does mean for a certain context. And you may be in that context in a lot of life, like with your spouse. And it can be revised. And the fact that you have it gives you an informed way to respond to situations. I was there when Leslie was so convinced of this that she would come to a training and people went in, they didn't have hierarchies criteria, and when they left, they did. She considered it that important a skill. Yeah. We think of it now, we teach it like everybody has one. But Rick, being willing to honestly share himself, shows what a number of us have, is that even in important parts of our lives, we don't always have it sorted out. And as I was just saying, also invite you and your wife to do any resorting on this that you want to do, because my point here is to get you going in a direction, because you two will know what's really important.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming up. Just take that with you. So these are some of the ways in which one can revise the structural problems of a decision process and get pervasive change across a lot of different areas of life. My invitation to you now is to go back to your groups and to do the change that the person most needs now with the difficulty as you found it. So in this case, it was hierarchy of criteria. With Gene, it was this divided mind where you would want to bring the criteria to the front and then have him go through the strategy again. For another person, it might be building a full representation in all the systems so they can step into the different options and find out which one they like best. For someone else, it might be updating the evidence for your criteria. The idea is if you want to eat better or live better, exercise, well, that means that I'm not watching television. You might want to revise criteria and go, well, that means I will be doing this or the other thing. Leslie Cameron Bandler, a wonderful example that relates right over to submodalities. She would talk about when people didn't have a reference experience. What does that mean? They didn't have evidence to make the comparison. When I was a kid, and I know this is going to come back to me, I know. My mother used to cook vegetables within an inch of their molecular structure. I'd be looking at it and going, well, it's cauliflower or it's broccoli, because it kind of looks like it might have been. Well, I consequently was not a great lover of vegetables. For all, vegetables were soggy. Porridge, vegetables, what's the difference? So there was no way that I really thought anything nice about them. But it wasn't the vegetables' fault. It wasn't even my mother's. I mean, because she grew up in the tradition she grew up in, and that's what you did with vegetables at that time. It was the growing techniques and the dangers of whatever was different. Canning and so forth. So one of the things that I did then was I began to eat better food. And then, and I'll get in trouble for this too, I went to France. And it changed my life. Because oranges tasted like oranges again. And tomatoes like tomatoes. And I was reminded of when I was a kid. Your modern grocery stores now, again, at a price, will have these wonderful things that taste like they're supposed to. But we know a lot of stuff doesn't. And the French, think what you will of them, they're arrogant about their food and they mean it. So the steaks, I mean, the things I would have there, and it reminded me that food could really taste fantastic. And that set a standard for me. And I remember the first time I was leaving France, I'm at the airport, and I'm just got a little bit of change in my pocket. And I go, what am I going to do? Get rid of it. And said, how much is that? And he said, oh, you can get 2. So I got these 2 little pieces of chocolate, little bars like this. I won't name the brand, just to. And I put them in the top of my suitcase and got on the flight. And I'm there with a cup of coffee after dinner, and I bite into one, and I go, I should have gotten more of these. And talk about submodalities. That was chocolate. And from then on, when I walk by the grocery counters, as you're going out, the impulse buying, the stacks of chocolate bars and stuff on either side, and my brain goes, that's not chocolate. Because the experience, the evidence, the reference experience I have now, by the way, since then I've gone on to Belgium and Swiss, but at the time, it was really good, that these kinds of experiences are another way to influence a strategy. This gives you another kind of insight into that strategies are changed not by deliberately sitting somebody down in a chair and staring at their eyes, but sometimes life changes them. That somebody will have an experience and they'll drink a good beer and they'll go, I'm not drinking cheap beer anymore. Or they'll go on a vacation and they'll realize vacations can refresh them and they never knew that before. And what happened was that they built evidence and criteria that they could now utilize in their strategy. This is a whole other area that isn't studied enough, where you can make changes to find out what kind of criteria and what kind of criteria equivalences the person is using and how they have or don't have them organized to serve their lives and their outcomes.
And it has a huge effect on what you tolerate and not tolerate, and all the decisions.
Well, and yeah, this goes back to the futures traders. There's a lot of these people that I studied, they played cards in college. So they were used to gambling, and they knew that you had to lose to win and win to lose. And they learned about making a measured bet. Because the idea, if you play cards, whatever, is that you get to come and play another day. Rule number 1, bet so you can play another day. And these early college rules translated to their business life the same way Erickson would describe somebody's riding a bicycle, would teach them the basics of traffic before they rode in a car. You have to allow room for braking. You have to be in control of your vehicle, and all these things that we don't think about learning. But in fact, we're learning all the time, and we translate these from one area of our life to another, and they do make a difference, yes. So with that, as I say, I invite you back to your groups to find out how you can upgrade the strategy the person's been using. To assist you in this process, you can look on the following pages, 3, 4, 5, and 6, where I list the different kinds of difficulties. And the processes that I've been demonstrating up here are written out step by step. And of course, we have an abundant number of coaches who would be happy to help you on your way. So same groups, about the same amount of time, maybe an hour, but put a break in there right now, and let's go.